The plastic tube was still in my hand when the phone rang, and I almost didn't answer it because I was busy laughing at my grandson trying to explain to me, for the third time, exactly how much spit a laboratory in Utah actually needed. It's a lot, Grandpa. Like a lot. That was the whole morning. Jonah, 9 years old, cross-legged on my kitchen floor, with a school genealogy packet spread out in front of him like a treasure map, walking me through the instructions for a DNA kit he'd begged his mother to buy me for Father's Day because his class was doing a family tree project and he wanted the real one, not the fake internet one. I did not think about it twice. I spit in a tube, sealed it, mailed it off in a padded envelope at the Conroe post office, and went back to living my life the way I had for 64 years. One ordinary day stacked on top of the last one. 6 weeks later, an email arrived with a subject line that read, "Your root line DNA results are ready. I want you to understand something before I go any further." I did not open that email looking for anything. I was not suspicious of my wife. I was not suspicious of my son. I had buried Diane 3 years earlier after 38 years of marriage, and if you had asked me that morning what I expected to find in a genealogy report, I would have told you. Probably some Irish, probably some German, maybe a distant cousin in Ohio I trade 2 friendly messages with and never speak to again. I opened the email on my laptop at the kitchen table, the same table Diane and I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts at, the same table where I'd once helped Cole with 4th grade long division and, decades later, helped him proofread his wedding vows. The house was quiet in the particular way an empty house gets quiet on a weekday morning, just the hum of the refrigerator and, faintly, a mockingbird working through its whole repertoire out by the pecan tree, the same tree Cole had broken his arm falling out of 30 years earlier. I clicked the link, expecting maybe 5 minutes of mild curiosity before I went back out to the shop. What I found instead was a single flagged line near the bottom of the report, under a heading I had never seen before. Close family, unexpected relationship detected. And beneath that, in the kind of clinical, bloodless language only a lab can produce, for words that took the floor out from under 37 years of my life. No biological paternal match. I read it 4 times before my brain would agree to process it as English. I need you to sit with me in that kitchen for a second, because everything that came after, every quiet decision, every document I copied, every night I sat across the dinner table from people I loved while carrying something none of them knew I was carrying, all of it started in that exact moment, standing at my own counter, coffee going cold, staring at a laptop screen that had just told me my son was not my son. My name is Raymond Hale. I am 64 years old, and until 3 years ago I ran Hale Electric out of a metal building on 32 acres of land about 40 miles north of Houston, just outside Conroe, Texas. Land has been in my family since before the interstate cut through this county and turned pasture land into subdivisions on either side of us like a tide coming in that never goes back out. I want to tell you about my hands first, because in this part of Texas, in my generation, a man's hands tell you more about him than his name does. 50 years of pulling wire through conduit, of standing on ladders in July heat that turns a metal roof into a griddle, of getting shocked more times than I'd ever admit to my insurance agent, will do something specific to a pair of hands. Mine are thick through the knuckles now, permanently a little swollen, and there's a scar across the base of my left thumb from 1987 that I can still describe the exact moment of getting, down to the smell of the burnt insulation. I built Hale Electric from a single used service truck I bought with money I did not have, into a company that, by the time I sold my share and stepped back 4 years ago, had 11 employees and a good enough name in 3 counties that people called and asked for me by name even after I technically retired from doing the actual work myself. I did not come from money. I came from less than nothing, if you want the honest version. My father left when I was 7 years old, and the last thing he ever said to my mother, standing in the doorway of a rent house in Willis, Texas, was that he was going to find something better, which turned out to mean a woman in Beaumont and a life that never once circled back to include me. My mother worked 2 jobs and raised 3 of us on a waitress's tips and a cleaning woman's wages, and I decided somewhere around age 12 that I was never, under any circumstance, going to be a man whose family had to wonder where he was. That decision shaped every single choice I made for the next 50 years. It's why I never missed a Little League game. It's why I was at every school play, every graduation, every hospital waiting room. It's why, when I met Diane Coleman at a church function in the spring of 1987 and fell for her harder and faster than I had any business falling for anyone, the thing that scared me most wasn't losing her. It was becoming, even once, even by accident, the kind of man my father had been. I have exactly one photograph of my father, an old, curled Polaroid my mother kept in a shoebox and never once threw away, no matter how many times I asked her to. And in it he is standing in front of a Ford pickup he did not own long enough to finish paying off, squinting into the sun, looking like a man who had not yet decided what kind of husband or father he was going to be, and never did decide, as it turned out, or decided in the worst possible direction, and simply never told anyone he'd made the choice. I do not think about him often, but I think about that Polaroid every single Father's Day, because it reminds me, in a way nothing else quite manages to, of the exact fork in the road I chose not to take. Diane and I had a good marriage. I want to say that plainly, because everything that happened later does not erase it, and I refuse to let it. She used to leave coffee on the counter before I woke up, not a note, just coffee. Hot. The pot still hissing when I came downstairs, because she was always up before the sun, and that was simply how she said good morning before either of us had said a word. She kept a garden she was terrible at maintaining and stubborn about not asking for help with. She laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, every single time, for 38 years, and I never once got tired of it. When she died of ovarian cancer 3 years ago, at a hospice facility in the Woodlands, I sat with her for the last 11 hours of her life, holding a hand that had gone thin and cool, and I promised her, out loud, that I would take care of our son. That was the last real conversation we had. I want you to remember that promise, because it becomes important later, in a way I never could have predicted standing in that hospice room. Our son is Cole. He is 37 years old now, an accountant, sharp with numbers in a way I never was, married to a woman named Vanessa, father to my grandson Jonah. Cole was born in April of 1989, 18 months after Diane and I got married. And for 37 years, I never had a single reason to think about that timeline as anything other than the beginning of the best part of my life. Here is the piece I did not know until the summer I'm telling you about. Here is the piece nobody told me. In the spring of 1988, 4 months before our wedding, Diane and I broke up for 11 weeks. It was not dramatic. There was no affair I knew about, no fight anyone would remember. I had just lost a job with an electrical outfit in Houston and moved back in with my mother in Willis, while I tried to get Hale Electric off the ground with nothing but a truck and a business card I'd printed at a copy shop. And Diane, 26 years old and finishing her business degree at Sam Houston State, got scared. Scared of marrying a man with no money and no guarantees. She told me she needed time. I gave it to her, because that is what you do when you love someone, and you're too proud and too broke to fight for anything else. 11 weeks later she called me, crying, and said she'd made a mistake, and we got back together. And 4 months after that we were married, and 8 months after that Diane told me she was pregnant. And I cried actual tears in the parking lot of a Whataburger on Highway 105 because I thought I was about to become the father I never had. For 37 years, that was the whole story. That was every version of the story I had ever been told, or ever needed. What I did not know, what that laboratory report was about to force me to learn, one document at a time, over the course of a summer that changed the shape of everything I believed about my own life, was that Diane had not spent those 11 weeks alone. Before I tell you who Cole's biological father is, I need to tell you who he became to me, and to the rest of this county, because the man Diane spent those 11 weeks with in the spring of 1988 is not a stranger I discovered in an old letter. He is a man I have shaken hands with. He is a man who sat 2 tables away from me at my own son's wedding reception, smiling, lifting a glass. His name is Gerald Voss, and by the time I found out what he was to my family, he owned more land in Montgomery County than any other private individual, through a company called Voss Land and Cattle. And he was, by every outward measure, one of the most respected men in this part of Texas. Gerald is 62 years old, silver-headed in that expensive, deliberate way that costs $400 every 6 weeks, and is never allowed to look like it costs anything. He drives a truck, because appearances matter to men like Gerald, but it's a truck that costs more than most people's houses, kept spotless. The kind of truck that has never once hauled anything heavier than a cooler full of good bourbon to a hunting lease. He shows up at the same Rotary luncheons I used to go to when I still had the patience for them. He gives, generously and visibly, to the volunteer fire department and the Youth Rodeo Association, and every dollar of it does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is make people say Gerald Voss's name in a tone of respect before they've had a single private conversation with him. I want to be fair, because fairness is something I promised myself I would hold on to through all of this, no matter how badly Gerald deserved to have it withheld from him. When I met him, really met him, at Cole's college graduation, where he showed up because he'd apparently been quietly present at the edges of Cole's academic career for years, funding a scholarship through a foundation with a name vague enough that nobody connected it to him. Gerald was warm, genuinely, disarmingly warm. He asked about my business. He asked good questions, the kind that made you feel like your answers actually mattered to him. He complimented Diane in a way that seemed almost fatherly, almost protective, and at the time I thought that was simply what generous, successful men did for the families of people whose work they respected. I remember specifically that he shook my hand twice that afternoon, once when he arrived and once when he left, and both times his grip lasted a half-second longer than a normal handshake, firm enough that I noticed it without being able to say exactly why I noticed it. The kind of handshake that isn't really a greeting at all but a small, wordless assertion about who is standing where in a room. I did not think anything of it at the time. Successful men shake hands like that. I had met plenty of them over 30 years of bidding electrical contracts against companies far bigger than mine, and I had learned mostly to let that particular kind of posturing roll off me without comment, because comment never won me a contract, and neither did taking the bait. Looking back now, with everything I know, I can see the first signal, so clearly it embarrasses me that I missed it. It was small. It was a single sentence, spoken at that graduation, that I filed away and forgot about for 15 years. Diane and Gerald were standing near the punch table, and I walked up mid-conversation, and Gerald was saying, with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes the way his other smiles did, "He's got your stubbornness, Diane." I could see it a mile off. And Diane's face did something I had never seen it do before or since. It went perfectly, carefully still, the way a pond goes, still right before something breaks the surface of it. She laughed it off. She changed the subject to the catering. I thought nothing of it, because why would I? A man complimenting my wife's personality trait, showing up in our son, is not the kind of sentence that sets off alarms in a happy marriage. I did not think about that sentence again for 15 years, until the night I sat in my truck outside a storage unit in Conroe with a flashlight and a shoebox full of Diane's old letters, and I read, in her own handwriting, dated April of 1988, 6 words that made every hair on my arm stand up. Gerald says he sees himself in him, but I'm getting ahead of the story, and this one deserves to be told the way it happened to me, not the way it makes sense to tell it now that I know how it ends. BR, the explicit moment, the one that should have told me something was deeply wrong long before any DNA test ever entered the picture, happened about 8 months before I mailed that spit tube to Utah, at a dinner Vanessa hosted to celebrate Cole's promotion at Voss Land and Cattle, where he had been working for about 3 years, by then as a vice president overseeing land acquisitions. I remember it was a Tuesday, which stuck with me because it seemed like an odd night for a celebration, and I found out later it was a Tuesday because that was the only night Gerald could make it, and Vanessa had built the entire evening around his schedule without a second thought, which tells you something about how thoroughly Gerald Voss had already worked his way into the architecture of my son's life by then. Gerald gave a toast. I remember every word of it, because I have replayed it in my head more times than any speech I've ever heard in my life, including my own wedding vows. He stood up, raised a glass of wine that cost more than my truck payment, and said, "I don't say this lightly, folks, because I don't hand out compliments I don't mean. But in 20-some years of doing business in this county, I have never worked with a young man who understands land, who understands what land is actually worth, underneath what it looks like on the surface, the way this one does. Cole, some men are born knowing things other men spend a lifetime trying to learn. You were born knowing this." Everyone at that table laughed and clapped and thought it was the sweetest thing they'd ever heard a boss say about an employee. Diane had been gone 8 months by then, So she wasn't there to hear it. And I have spent more hours than I'm proud of wondering what her face would have done if she had been. I laughed too. I raised my glass. I felt, in that exact moment, a small, cold, wordless discomfort that I could not name and did not examine. The kind of feeling you get when someone tells a joke that's almost, but not quite, at your expense. And you laugh anyway, because naming the discomfort out loud would make the whole room uncomfortable, and you've spent 64 years being the man who smoothed things over instead of the man who makes things worse. I did not scream. I did not confront anyone. I finished my dinner, complimented the caterer, hugged my son goodbye in the driveway, and drove home to an empty house 40 minutes away and sat in my truck in my own driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I want you to notice that discomfort, because it was the truth arriving early, quietly, the way it almost always does. It just didn't have a name yet. It wouldn't get one for another 8 months, until a laboratory in Utah gave it one for me, in 4 clinical words on a computer screen, on a Tuesday morning that started with my grandson explaining spit collection procedures and ended with me understanding, for the first time in my life, that I had spent 37 years loving a boy who had been born from a story I was never told the real version of. The morning I read that email, I did what I imagine most people do, which is nothing at all for about 4 hours. I made coffee I didn't drink. I walked out to the shop and moved tools from one shelf to another shelf for no reason. I sat in the recliner Diane picked out for me in 2009 and stared at a television that wasn't turned on. Around 1 in the afternoon, I called the number for Rootline's customer support line, and a very patient young woman named Priya walked me through what the report actually meant, in words gentler than the report itself had used. She explained that no biological paternal match in a father-son test comparison meant exactly what it said, that the man listed as the tester's father shared no more genetic material with the son than a random stranger would. She explained, delicately, that this could mean an error, a lab mix-up, a mislabeled sample. She told me those errors happen in roughly 1 in 10,000 cases, and she offered me a free retest kit at no charge. I ordered the retest kit that same afternoon, because some part of me, the part of me that had built a business by never assuming the worst about a wire until I traced it myself, needed to see if this was simply a mistake the universe was going to correct. It was not a mistake. The second kit came back 11 days later, and it said exactly the same thing, in exactly the same clinical language, and this time there was a second flag beneath the first one, a feature of the website I hadn't noticed the first time because I hadn't scrolled far enough. It was labeled possible close relatives and public trees, and beneath it was a single name, connected to my son's genetic profile by a percentage that the site labeled, in a small gray tooltip I had to click to understand, as consistent with a first cousin, a half-sibling, or an uncle. The name was Marcus Voss. I did not recognize it right away. It took me almost a full minute of staring at the screen, my hands gone cold in the middle of July, with the air conditioning barely keeping the house at 74 degrees, my hands cold anyway, before the last name connected in my brain to a man I had shaken hands with a dozen times over the years. Gerald Voss had a younger brother named Marcus, who had died in a hunting accident in 2011. I remembered it because Cole had gone to the funeral. I had thought at the time, simply as a courtesy, the way an employee attends a boss's family funeral. Marcus Voss's DNA, apparently uploaded to a public genealogy database years ago by a daughter of his doing her own family research, was sitting in a public tree, waiting for exactly the kind of accidental cross-match that had just detonated quietly inside my kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Everything got slow after that. I don't have a better way to describe it. Everything got slow and quiet, like the volume on the whole world had been turned most of the way down, and I remember standing up for the kitchen table and walking to the window and looking out at 32 acres of land my father's father had cleared with a mule, and thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that I needed to talk to someone who had actually known my wife back then, someone who might still be alive, someone who might tell me the truth, or at least a truthful-shaped piece of it, without flinching. I called Diane's younger sister, Peggy, who still lives in Willis and has never in her 71 years learned how to keep an opinion to herself, which is exactly the quality I needed from another human being at that exact moment. Peggy did not lie to me. I will give her that much credit. even though what she told me took another 4 days to fully arrive. For days during which I barely slept and barely ate, and told absolutely no one. Not Cole, not Vanessa, not my grandson, not a single soul at the diner, where I still eat breakfast 3 mornings a week, what I had learned. Peggy told me, over sweet tea on her back porch, in a voice that kept dropping to almost a whisper even though there was nobody within a quarter mile to overhear us, that during the 11 weeks Diane and I were broken up in the spring of 1988, Diane had, in fact, spent time with Gerald Voss, who back then was not yet the wealthy man he'd become, but was already, in Peggy's words, slick and older, and had a way of making a scared 26-year-old girl feel like the smartest person in any room he walked into. Peggy said Diane never told her, specifically, whether Cole was Gerald's son. She said Diane had wondered, privately, quietly, agonizingly, in the weeks after she and I got back together and she found out she was pregnant. She said Diane had done the math in her head 100 times, the way any woman in that position would, trying to count backward to a certainty that biology does not always allow a person to reach on their own, without the kind of science that did not exist yet in 1988 the way it exists now. She said Diane made a decision she carried, silently, for the rest of her life, to believe, and to raise our son believing, that he was mine, because the timing was close enough to plausible, because she loved me, because she had watched me lose my own father, and swore she would never be the reason I lost a son too. She loved you something fierce, Raymond, Peggy told me, and her eyes were wet by then, and so were mine. She made her peace with never knowing for certain. She used to say the not knowing was a mercy. She said some doors, once you open them, you can't ever close again, and some families only survive because somebody had the good sense to leave a door shut. I asked Peggy if Gerald had ever known. She said she believed he suspected. She said Diane told her once, years ago, after a few too many glasses of wine at a family Christmas, that Gerald had reached out to her exactly once, when Cole was about 4 years old, at a grocery store in Conroe, and had looked at a photograph of him clipped to Diane's keyring, and had said 6 words that Diane repeated to Peggy so many times over the years that Peggy still had them memorized, word for word, 30 years later. He said, I'd know that face anywhere. I remember the exact sound of Peggy's porch swing creaking under both of us, while I tried to make my brain hold 2 true things at once, that Diane had loved me completely, and that Diane had also carried something enormous away from me for 38 years. Those 2 facts did not want to sit next to each other peacefully. I kept trying to arrange them like furniture in a room that was too small for both of them, and neither one would fit against the wall the way I needed it to. Peggy poured me a second glass of tea I never drank, and told me one more thing before I left that afternoon. Something she said she debated telling me for years, and had decided, watching my face on her porch that day, that I finally deserved to hear. She said that in the last month of Diane's life, in the hospice, on one of the nights I'd gone home to shower and sleep for a few hours at Diane's insistence, Diane had asked Peggy to promise her something. She'd asked Peggy to promise that if the truth about Cole ever came out, if it ever surfaced, by accident or by choice, after she was gone, Peggy would tell me, without hesitation, exactly how much Diane had loved us both, me and the boy she'd chosen never to stop calling mine. She wasn't asking me to protect a secret, Raymond, Peggy said, her voice cracking on the last word. She was asking me to protect you. She knew this might come out someday. She just prayed it wouldn't come out ugly. I sat with that a long time after Peggy said it. I am still sitting with it, if I'm honest with you tonight. I sat on Peggy's porch for a long time after that, not talking, and Peggy had the good sense not to fill the silence, and somewhere in that silence I made the second real decision of this entire story. The first decision had been to find out the truth. The second decision, the one that would define everything I did for the next 6 months, was that I was not going to confront anyone yet. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this that a lot of people would get wrong, and I understand the instinct to get it wrong. Every fiber of me wanted to drive straight to Gerald Voss's office that same afternoon and put a laboratory report on his desk and watch his face. But I had spent 50 years building things, a marriage, a business, a family, one careful decision at a time, and I was not about to blow up the last 37 years of my life on the strength of a single conversation with a woman on a porch and a name in a genealogy database. I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I let anyone know I was looking at anything at all. Because if Gerald Voss had known, or suspected, for 37 years, and had spent the last several of them quietly working his way into my son's professional life, mentoring him, funding him, positioning him, then this was not simply an old, sad secret about a woman I loved and had lost. This was something happening right now, in the present tense, and I needed to know exactly what it was before I decided what to do about it. I called a man named Walt Prescott, who I'd known for almost 30 years, ever since he retired from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, and started doing private investigative work on the side, mostly insurance fraud and skip tracing, work I'd used him for exactly once before, back when a former employee of mine had walked off with a company truck. Walt is 70 years old, moves slow, talks slower, and has a mind like a bear trap. He wears the same brand of straw hat year-round, indoors and out, a habit his late wife apparently spent 40 years failing to break him of, and he takes his coffee black and his conversations slower than most men his age have the patience left for, which is exactly why I trusted him with something this fragile. Walt does not rush toward conclusions. He circles them, patiently, from every side, the way a good investigator learns to after enough years of watching hasty men get the wrong answer fast and confidently. I met him at a diner off 105, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that's been on the burner too long, and I told him everything. The DNA test, the public database match, Peggy's story, the toast at the dinner, the comment at the graduation 15 years earlier that I hadn't understood the weight of until now. Walt listened without interrupting a single time, which is rare for him, and when I finished he was quiet for almost a full minute, stirring sugar into coffee he'd stopped drinking 5 minutes earlier. Then he said the sentence that reframed the entire second half of the story for me, the sentence I have thought about nearly every day since. Raymond, a man doesn't fund a scholarship for a stranger's kid for 15 years and then hand him a vice president title at his own company out of guilt. Guilt makes a man write a check once and disappear. This is not guilt. This is a man building something, and you need to find out what before he finishes building it. I asked him what he thought Gerald was building. Walt said, Gerald Voss doesn't have children of his own, never married, never had kids, not that anybody in this county has ever heard about. And you're telling me he's got a company called Voss Land and Cattle, worth I don't know how many millions, and a young man on his executive team who happens to be his own blood, who happens not to know it, who happens to have a father, you, sitting on 32 acres of prime frontage land off the interstate that Voss Land and Cattle has been trying to buy up in that corridor for 6 years. I'd start there, if I were you. I'd start with your land. I want to tell you that my stomach dropped when he said that, but the truth is something colder happened. Something settled into my chest, heavy and precise, like furniture being moved into a room I did not want furnished. Because Walt was right about one thing I hadn't told him yet, one thing I hadn't even fully let myself think about until that exact second sitting in that vinyl booth. 6 weeks earlier, Cole had called me, sounding excited in a way he hadn't sounded about anything in a long time, to tell me that Voss Land and Cattle was putting together a major mixed-use development off the interstate frontage road, retail, a hotel, medical offices, and that the single piece of land standing between the company and a fully assembled parcel large enough to make the whole project work was mine. 32 acres. My father's land. My grandfather's land. Before that, Cole had asked me, gently, carefully, in the voice of a son who genuinely believed he was bringing his father good news, whether I'd ever consider selling. I remember exactly where I was standing when he asked me. In the shop, wiping grease off a socket wrench I didn't even need to be cleaning, the phone wedged between my shoulder and my ear the way I've talked on the phone for 40 years, because I never trusted myself to stand still while I listened to something important. Cole's voice had that particular brightness in it that I recognized from when he was a boy bringing home a report card. The sound of someone who has practiced a sentence in the mirror because he wants it to land exactly right. Dad, I know this land means everything to you, and I would never push you on it. But I wanted you to hear the number from me before you heard it from anybody else, because it's a good number. And Gerald specifically said He wanted you to have first right of refusal before anyone even puts pen to paper on the assembly. I told him I'd think about it. I did not tell him that the phrase Gerald specifically said had lodged itself somewhere behind my sternum the second it left his mouth, or that I would spend the next several weeks turning that sentence over and over in my mind, the way you turn a stripped screw over in your hand trying to figure out which way it's actually supposed to go. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story where I had to become a different kind of man than I had been my whole life, and it did not come naturally to me. I am, by nature, a direct person. 50 years in the trades will do that to you. When a circuit is wrong, you don't dance around it. You find the fault, and you fix it. But Walt made me understand, over the following weeks, that if I confronted Gerald Voss with what I knew before I understood the full shape of what he was doing, he would simply deny it, produce a lawyer, smooth it over the way wealthy men, who have spent their whole lives smoothing things over, always do, and I would lose any chance of ever knowing the truth or protecting my son from whatever was actually happening. So I did something that went against every honest bone in my body. I performed normalcy. For the next 4 months, I had dinner with Cole and Vanessa and Jonah on the second Sunday of every month, the way we always had, and I sat at that table making small talk about Jonah's Little League season and Vanessa's new job at the hospital, while I carried, silently, the knowledge that the boy across the table calling me Dad, a word that still made my chest tighten every single time, maybe more now than ever, did not share a single strand of DNA with me. I hugged him goodbye in driveways. I helped him move a couch. I sat through a Voss Land and Cattle Company barbecue in October, shook Gerald Voss's hand, let him clap me on the shoulder and tell me my son was the best hire this company's made in a decade. And I smiled, and I said thank you, and I drove home and sat in my truck in my driveway for a long time, the way I had that first night. Except now I understood exactly what that cold feeling had been trying to tell me all along. At exactly 4:40 in the afternoon on a Thursday in September, I drove to the Montgomery County Clerk's office and pulled the complete title history and mineral rights record on my own 32 acres, land I had assumed I understood perfectly, only to be handed a folder by a records clerk that contained something I had never once, in 64 years of living on and near that property, been told about. In 1961, my grandfather, Elias Hale, had leased the mineral and subsurface rights beneath that 32 acres to a small independent oil concern for a token sum, a common enough practice in this part of Texas at the time, and had structured the lease with an unusual clause, one his lawyer at the time apparently insisted on, according to a handwritten margin note in the original document, stating that any future surface development requiring subsurface access, easement, or drilling, disturbance would require the signed, notarized consent of the surface rights holder, in perpetuity, tied to the land itself, and not merely to the current owner. The mineral rights had long since reverted, and used, back to my family decades ago. But the clause, the consent clause, had never been removed from the deed, because nobody had ever needed to remove it. It had sat there, quietly, for 63 years, doing nothing at all. Until now, because the development the size Cole had described to me, the size Voss land and cattle needed to assemble to make their interstate frontage project work, could not physically be built, could not get a single permit approved by the county, without addressing that subsurface access clause on my property specifically. A fact I would guess Gerald Voss's own land attorneys had discovered months, maybe years, before I did. Walt Prescott, when I called him with this, was quiet again for a long moment, and then he said something I have repeated to myself more times than I can count in the months since. Raymond, that man has spent 37 years thinking he had all the leverage in his family. Turns out your grandfather beat him to it by 60 years, and neither one of you knew it. Walt also told me something practical that night, sitting in his truck in my driveway with the engine still ticking as it cooled, something that shaped every decision I made for the rest of that fall. He told me that men like Gerald Voss do not lose control of a situation gracefully, because they have spent their entire adult lives constructing rooms where they are always the smartest, calmest, most powerful person present. He's going to feel that room the second you walk into it. Walt said, the trick isn't beating him with anger. The trick is being the only calm person left standing once his own room turns on him. Cornered men do the damage to themselves. Your job is just to make sure it's witnessed. I did not fully understand what he meant until the day it happened. I understood it completely the moment it did. Looking back now, I think that single piece of advice, more than any document in my folder, was the thing that actually won the day. Not the paperwork, not the DNA report, but the discipline of staying quiet, staying calm, and letting a man who had spent his whole life controlling every room he walked into finally lose control of one, entirely on his own, in front of everyone who mattered. There is a particular kind of loneliness in carrying a secret this large through ordinary family life, and I don't think I've heard many people describe it accurately. So let me try. It is not the loneliness of being alone. I was surrounded that entire fall by more family than most men my age get to enjoy. Sunday dinners, Jonah's baseball games, Vanessa's birthday. A Thanksgiving I hosted myself for the first time since Diane died, standing at my own stove basting a turkey, while my son and his family filled my kitchen with noise and warmth I could have drowned in gratefully if I hadn't been carrying, underneath every second of it, a folder of documents locked in my truck's glove compartment that I checked on, compulsively, every single time I stepped outside for firewood. It is the loneliness of watching someone you love laugh at your dinner table, completely at ease, while you alone understand that the ground under the whole table might not be as solid as it looks. I caught myself, more than once, studying Cole's face across a plate of mashed potatoes, looking for Gerald Voss in it the way you'd look for a word on the tip of your tongue, and hating myself a little each time for looking, because looking felt like a betrayal of my own son even though he had done nothing at all to deserve my suspicion. He was still exactly the boy I raised. The only thing that had changed was what I now knew about how he came to be that boy in the first place. I gathered everything I had, methodically, the same way I used to trace a bad circuit back to its source, one junction at a time, never skipping a connection. I had the 2 DNA reports, notarized copies made at a UPS store in Conroe. The clerk there giving me a strange look when I asked her to notarize a genetic paternity document, but doing it without comment, the way good clerks do. I had a written statement from Peggy, which she gave me willingly, tearfully, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, signed and dated, recounting everything she remembered Diane telling her over the years, including the grocery store encounter and the 6 words Gerald had said about knowing that face anywhere. I had the title history and the original 1961 lease document with the consent clause, certified copies, pulled from the county clerk's office. I had something else, too. Something Walt found that I never would have found on my own. Walt, doing the kind of quiet, patient digging that had made him good at his job for 30 years, had gotten hold of a set of internal emails from a mutual acquaintance who did contract survey work for Voss land and cattle. Emails the man shared with Walt over drinks one night without fully understanding what he was handing over. In one of those emails, dated 4 months before my grandson ever handed me a DNA kit, Gerald Voss had written to his lead land attorney about the Hale parcel and the mineral consent clause, and I want to give you his exact words, because I have never once needed to check my memory of them. Not once. Not on the worst nights. The old man doesn't need to understand any of this. Gerald had written. He just needs to sign what Cole puts in front of him. Cole trusts me completely, and the old man trusts Cole completely, and that's worth more to this deal than anything our attorneys could draft. Keep this out of anything that goes to him directly. The old man. That was me. 37 years of loving a boy as my own son, of raising him, teaching him to drive, walking him down the aisle at his own wedding, and to the man who had actually fathered him, I was simply an obstacle with the signature Gerald needed, to be managed through the affection of the son I'd raised, an affection Gerald was apparently confident enough in to put in writing. I read that sentence so many times I could recite it in my sleep, and some nights, in the months that followed, I did exactly that, waking up at 3 in the morning with those words already halfway out of my mouth. I want to tell you something honest here, something I did not expect to feel and am not entirely proud of. Somewhere underneath the anger, and there was plenty of anger, make no mistake, there was something else, a strange, complicated grief for the boy Gerald Voss himself might have wanted to be. Once, a long time ago, before whatever had hardened him into a man capable of writing a sentence like that about someone who had never once wronged him. I did not excuse him for it. I do not excuse him for it now. But I noticed the feeling, and I have decided not to pretend it wasn't there, because I think pretending our villains are simple is how we end up surprised, over and over, when the people closest to us turn out to be complicated too. The confrontation happened on a Saturday in late November, at the groundbreaking ceremony for the very development that had started this entire chain of events, a catered event under a white tent set up on land adjacent to mine, with a small stage, a podium, a ceremonial gold shovel leaned against a folding table, county commissioners in attendance, a local news crew from Houston setting up a single camera near the back, and about 80 guests, including Cole and Vanessa, and, seated in a place of honor near the front, Gerald Voss, in a gray suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have never once had to think about money. I had not been invited, technically. I came anyway, walking in from the access road that borders my own property line, in a clean pair of jeans and my good boots, carrying a folder I had spent 4 months assembling. It was cold that morning, cold for southeast Texas in late November anyway, somewhere in the low 50s, and I remember my breath fogging slightly as I walked up that access road, the folder tucked under my arm, inside a plastic sleeve to keep the dew off it, my good boots picking up mud at the edge of the gravel where the caterers' trucks had chewed up the grass getting the tent set up. I could hear a country radio station playing low, through a portable speaker somebody had left running near the refreshment table, and the particular smell of brisket smoking in a trailer parked at the edge of the lot, and underneath all of it, my own heartbeat, loud enough in my ears that I genuinely wondered, for a second, whether anyone standing near me could hear it too. I want you to picture Gerald's face when he saw me walking toward that stage, because I have never in 64 years watched a man's confidence drain out of him so completely, so silently, in real time. He was mid-handshake with a county commissioner when he spotted me, and I watched the smile stay exactly where it was on his face, while everything behind his eyes went cold and calculating in the span of about 2 seconds. I did not raise my voice. I want that understood clearly, because I think it mattered more than almost anything else I did that day. I walked up to the small stage area, waited for a natural pause after the commissioner finished a few opening remarks about economic growth for the corridor, and I said, loud enough to carry, but calm enough that not a single person in that tent could have called it a scene. Before anybody breaks ground on anything, there's something the people in this tent have a right to see, since most of you are about to invest money in a project that legally cannot be built without something my family has held for 63 years. I opened the folder. I laid out the mineral consent clause first, holding up the certified copy for the commissioners near the front to see, explaining, in plain language, that no subsurface disturbance on the assembled parcel could proceed without my signed, notarized consent that had never been requested, let alone given. Gerald recovered fast. I'll give him that. Stage 1. Exactly the way Walt had told me it would go weeks earlier, when he walked me through what to expect. Gerald stood, smiling for the cameras, and said something smooth about a simple oversight in the title work our attorneys are already correcting, and turned to gesture for someone to escort me away. I did not move. Stage 2 came next, right on schedule, though I don't think Gerald himself knew he was following a script that had played out 1,000 times before in 1,000 other rooms, just like this one. He lowered his voice, stepped closer, and said, quietly, only for me, Raymond, let's not do this here. Whatever this is about, I'll make it worth your while. Name a number. I said, still calm, still not raising my voice. This isn't about the land, Gerald. Well, it is, but not the way you think. And then I laid the second document on the table, the DNA report, and beside it, Peggy's signed statement. I watched something happen to Gerald Voss's face in that moment that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was not shock, exactly. It was the specific, particular look of a man realizing that a door he had spent 37 years believing was permanently shut had just been kicked open in front of 80 witnesses and a local news camera. And then came stage 3. The one Walt had warned me was the most dangerous and the most revealing. The moment a cornered man makes the mistake that finishes him without any further help from anyone else. Gerald, flustered now, his voice rising for the first time, turned toward Cole, who was standing frozen near the front of the small crowd, having just watched his entire understanding of his own life come apart in under 90 seconds, and said, loud enough now that the news camera absolutely caught it, loud enough that it made the evening broadcast that night. "Cole, I built a place for you at this company because you're mine. Do you understand that? Blood, that's worth more than anything this old electrician ever gave you. I want you to understand what that silence actually contained, because silence in a moment like that is never really empty." It was 80 people recalculating, in real time, everything they thought they understood about 3 men standing at the front of that tent. It was a news camera operator near the back who I later learned had actually stopped adjusting his tripod and simply let it run, sensing, correctly, that he had stumbled into something no press release was ever going to be able to walk back. It was Vanessa, standing near the front, one hand flown up to cover her mouth, and Cole beside her, absolutely motionless, staring at Gerald Voss with an expression I have never seen on my son's face before or since. Not anger yet, not even hurt yet, just a kind of total, stunned recalibration. The look of a man watching the floor of his own life get pulled out from under him one board at a time. The tent went dead silent. I did not say another word for almost 30 seconds. I let that sentence sit in the air over that crowd exactly as long as it needed to sit there, because I understood. The way you understand a circuit is about to trip before it actually does. That Gerald Voss had just done more damage to himself in one sentence than I could have done to him with every document in my folder combined. Into that silence stepped a man I had not expected, a man Walt had quietly arranged to be present that day without my full understanding of why until that exact moment. A title attorney named Sam Okafor, retained not by me, but by the county, present at the groundbreaking specifically to verify clear title before the county allowed any public infrastructure commitments to move forward. Sam had been standing near the commissioners the entire time, had reviewed the documents I'd laid out within the first 60 seconds of my speaking, and now stepped forward and said, in the flat, procedural voice of a man whose job it is to say true things regardless of how they land. "For the record, the county cannot approve any permits on this assembled parcel until the consent issue on the Hale property is formally resolved. This groundbreaking, as scheduled, cannot legally proceed today." That was it. That was the sentence that ended it. Not my anger. Not my grief. A land attorney reading a fact into the record in front of a news camera, while Gerald Voss stood on a small stage under a white tent with a gold ceremonial shovel he was never going to get to use. I did not stay to watch what happened after that. I did not gloat, and I want to be honest that I did not particularly feel like gloating either. I walked back across the access road toward my own property line alone, while behind me I could hear the confused, urgent murmur of 80 people trying to figure out what they had just watched. I sat on my own back porch for almost 2 hours that afternoon, not doing anything, not even really thinking in complete sentences, just sitting with the strange, heavy quiet that comes after something enormous finally stops being a secret. I was not triumphant. I want that understood. Somewhere underneath everything else, I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with my body. The specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 4 months performing an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary weight, finally allowed to set that weight down. I remember thinking, sitting there on that porch with the November light going long and gold across the pasture, that I had spent 4 months rehearsing this exact moment in my head 100 different ways, and not one of those rehearsals had prepared me for how quiet the real thing would actually feel afterward. I had imagined shouting. I had imagined some version of myself finally saying every furious thing I'd swallowed at that Tuesday dinner, at that graduation, at every moment over the years when some small, unnamed wrongness had passed through me, and I'd let it go because that was easier than naming it. Instead, I had said maybe 40 sentences total, in a voice barely raised above conversation, and it had been enough, more than enough. Sometimes the truth does not need volume. It only needs to be true, and witnessed, and finally spoken out loud in a room that can no longer pretend not to have heard it. And I felt something else, something complicated, something I did not expect. I felt grief, not for Gerald exactly, though there was a strange, thin thread of that too. For the man he might have been of 37 years ago, he had simply told the truth, instead of building a scholarship fund and a job title as a slow, silent substitute for a relationship he never had the courage to claim honestly. But mostly I felt grief for Diane, gone 3 years now, who had carried this alone her entire adult life, who had made a choice out of love and fear in equal measure and had never once, in 38 years of marriage, let me see the weight of it. I understood her more completely in that moment than I ever had while she was alive, and I would have given almost anything to be able to tell her so. Cole called me that night, close to 11. His voice wrecked in a way I had not heard since he was 7 years old and broke his arm, falling out of the pecan tree behind our old house. He did not ask me if it was true. I think some part of him had already decided it was. The moment the words left Gerald's mouth in front of that camera, what he asked me instead, in a voice barely holding together, was, "Are you still my dad?" I did not hesitate, not for a fraction of a second, because there was nothing in this entire story that had ever once been in question as far as I was concerned. I said, "I have been your father since before you could hold your own head up, and I am not stopping now because a laboratory in Utah had an opinion about it." He cried on the phone for a long time after that, and I let him, and I did not try to fill the silence with anything except the occasional, quiet reminder that I was still there. Somewhere near midnight, once his breathing had finally leveled out, Cole asked me the second question, the one I had been dreading more than the first, in a smaller voice than I'd heard from him since he was a boy. Did Mom know? I told him the truth, as gently as I knew how to tell it, that I believed she had suspected, that she had never been certain, that whatever she had or hadn't known, she had spent every single day of his life choosing him, completely and without reservation, as her son. I told him what Peggy told me about the deathbed promise, about Diane asking her sister to make sure I understood how much she'd loved us both. I heard him exhale, long and shaking, on the other end of the line, and he said, so quietly I almost missed it, "That's the only part that matters to me, Dad, that she chose us." I have thought about that sentence nearly every day since, because I think it might be the truest thing either one of us said that whole terrible, necessary year. Here is what happened afterward, told the way I'd tell you if you asked me over coffee, plainly, without dressing it up. The development collapsed within about 6 weeks. Not because of me directly. I never once refused to grant the consent, and in fact, once the dust settled and cooler lawyers got involved, I did eventually sign a limited, carefully negotiated easement, with real compensation attached to it this time, compensation that went directly into a trust for my grandson Jonah's education, because I decided a long time ago that whatever came out of this ugly chapter should end up serving the one truly innocent person in the entire story. But the reputational damage from that videotaped groundbreaking was fatal in a business that runs almost entirely on trust and appearances. 2 of Voss Land and Cattle's major financial partners pulled out within the month. Gerald's own board, such as it was, forced a restructuring that removed him from day-to-day control of the company by the following spring. Last I heard, and I only heard this secondhand through Walt, who still keeps half an ear to the ground out of old habit, Gerald Voss sold his ranch house outside Montgomery at something close to a loss and moved into a rental property in Huntsville, doing land consulting work for a smaller outfit at a fraction of what he used to make. Sometimes the bottom is the only honest place left for a man to start building something real, if he's even willing to start at all. I don't know if Gerald is. That part of the story isn't mine to finish for him. Vanessa, I should tell you, handled all of it with a grace that surprised even me. She never once treated Cole differently in front of Jonah, never let the boy sense for even a single afternoon that anything fundamental about his family had shifted underneath him, and I think, of everyone in this story, she may be the one who understood fastest and most completely that none of it changed a single true thing about who Cole actually was, or who I actually was to him. She told me once, a few months after the groundbreaking, standing in my kitchen while Jonah ran laps around the yard outside, "You didn't earn the title Grandpa from a test tube either, Raymond. Jonah doesn't love you less for whatever a lab says. None of us do." I have held on to that sentence, the way I've held on to very few things in my life. Cole did not go back to work for Voss Land and Cattle, obviously, and it took him the better part of a year to find solid footing again, both professionally and inside himself. He started his own small accounting practice out of a strip mall office in Conroe, and about 8 months ago he asked me, almost shyly, if I'd be willing to come by once a week and just sit in his office lobby some afternoons for the company. He said, though I think we both understood it was about something a little deeper than company. I go every Thursday. I drink his terrible coffee and read the newspaper in his waiting room, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we don't. And that, more than any document or DNA report, has been the actual healing of this whole thing. 1 year out from that day under the white tent, my life looks smaller in some ways and steadier in almost every way that matters. I still live on the 32 acres. I put a new bathtub in the main bathroom last spring, nothing fancy, simple white porcelain. And I stood in the doorway one morning with my coffee looking at it and thought, strangely, about how something so small can split open something so large, the way a $1,200 plumbing fixture had somehow become the physical marker in my mind for the moment I finally started feeling like myself again in that house. Saturday mornings, Jonah rides along with me to the hardware store in town, and he points at things on the shelves, ceiling fans, mostly, for some reason, though we own 3 already. Like each one is a genuine miracle, and it makes me laugh every single time. The exact same reaction in the exact same aisle, and some tenderness in this old, complicated family is exactly there, waiting for a 9-year-old boy to point at a ceiling fan and remind an old man why any of this was ever worth protecting in the first place. I still have that first crumpled root line printout, the one with the 4 clinical words that started all of it, folded up in the same folder as everything else, tucked now in the top drawer of the desk that used to be Diane's. I don't look at it often, but I keep it on purpose, because I think a man ought to hold onto the exact piece of paper that once told him a hard truth, if only to remind himself, on the days he needs reminding, that he survived reading it. If there's one true sentence this whole story has left me with, it's this one, and I want to say it plainly, because I believe it all the way down to the bottom of me now. Love is not a fact you discover. Love is a decision you keep making, over and over, long after the facts have changed underneath it. I think about my own father sometimes, still, even at 64, even after everything. He shared every strand of DNA a man could share with me, and he was gone before I turned 8, and I have spent my entire life discovering, over and over, in small ways, that biology was never once the thing I actually needed from him. What I needed was somebody to show up, somebody to stay. Gerald Voss shared blood with my son and gave him scholarships from a distance and a job title dressed up as mentorship, and never once, in 37 years, had the courage to simply sit across a table from him and say the truth out loud, man to man, and let the relationship survive or fail on its own honest terms. I gave Cole nothing of my blood, and gave him every single ordinary day of my life instead. And I know, without a shadow of a doubt, which one of those two things actually built a father. I did not become Cole's father because of a shared strand of DNA 37 years ago. I became his father across 10,000 ordinary days, bandaging his knees, teaching him to check his own oil, sitting up with him the night before his wedding when he got nervous and needed someone steady in the room. A laboratory report cannot undo 10,000 ordinary days. It can only tell you where they started. It cannot tell you what they meant. If you are watching this tonight and some version of this exact fear has crossed your mind, a DNA test you're afraid to take, a family secret you already suspect but haven't confirmed, a child you love that biology might complicate, I want you to hear this clearly. The people who raised you, or the people you raised, are not made smaller by the truth of where they came from. They are made exactly as large as the love that was actually, consistently, patiently shown to them, day after day, whether or not the facts underneath it ever match what everyone assumed. If you are the adult child in this story, the one who finds out, later in life, that something you believed about your own origin was not quite the whole truth, please hear this too. You did not do anything wrong by existing inside a secret someone else chose to keep. The confusion, the grief, the strange vertigo of your own history shifting under your feet, all of that is real and it deserves space, and it does not make you disloyal to grieve it even while you continue loving the people who raised you. You are allowed to hold both feelings at once, gratitude for the life you were given, and grief for the version of the truth you were never handed the chance to choose for yourself. Nobody gets to tell you how long that grieving is supposed to take, or how quickly you're supposed to arrive at forgiveness, if forgiveness is even the destination you decide you want. Take whatever time the truth actually requires of you. It will not rush, and neither should you. If you are a parent who is carrying a secret like Diane carried hers, and I suspect some of you watching tonight are, I am not going to stand here and tell you exactly what to do, because Diane's choice, made out of fear and love in equal measure at 26 years old, is not a choice I can judge from the comfort of everything I know now. But I will tell you this. Secrets do not actually protect the people we love from pain. They only delay it and hand it to someone else to carry later, usually alone, usually at the worst possible moment. If there's a door in your life you have kept shut out of love, ask yourself honestly whether it is protecting the people on the other side of it, or simply protecting you from having to watch their face while you open it. And if you are the person, right now, sitting with a suspicion you have not yet confirmed, a feeling in your gut about a parent, a spouse, a child, a piece of family history that doesn't quite add up, here is one practical thing I want you to do this week. Something small, something within your reach. Do not confront anyone yet. Do not accuse anyone yet. Simply gather what you can, quietly, patiently, the way I gathered documents in that folder for 4 long months. Pull the records. Write down the dates. Talk to the one person in your family who has never learned how to keep an opinion to herself, because every family has a Peggy, and Peggy will tell you the truth if you're brave enough to sit on her porch and ask. You are not being paranoid by wanting to know your own history. You are simply awake in a family where, for a long time, you were the only one who wasn't. I want to leave you with one question tonight, and I want you to actually sit with it instead of scrolling past it the way we all scroll past everything now. Is there a version of your own family story you have never fully questioned, simply because questioning it felt too dangerous to survive? And if there is, what exactly are you afraid you'll lose by finally asking? Before you go, I'd love to hear from you, because these comment sections have become one of the most meaningful parts of my week, and I mean that with my whole heart. I read them at night, most nights, sitting in that same recliner Dan picked out years ago, and I have come to genuinely look forward to it. The way you look forward to sitting down with old friends who happen to understand exactly what you've been carrying, without you having to explain the whole thing from the beginning. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe Diane made the right choice all those years ago, keeping this secret to protect her family. Drop a 2 if you think the truth, even a painful one, should always come out sooner, no matter the cost. Drop a 3 if some part of this story touched something real and personal in your own life. A family secret, a parent who wasn't who you thought, a child you raised who wasn't biologically yours, but was every bit your own. And one more thing, if you don't mind. Tell me where you're watching this from, and what time it is there right now. Someone out there is going to be watching this at 2 in the morning, from somewhere I would never expect, unable to sleep for their own reasons, and somehow, this is going to be exactly the story they needed tonight. That means something to me, genuinely. Every single time I read those comments. If stories like this one means something to you, I'd be honored to have you stick around. This channel isn't really about entertainment. It's about the quiet, complicated, unglamorous truth of what it actually means to love people in a family that isn't always fair to us. And I'm grateful, more than you know, to have you here for it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Montgomery County, Texas, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, a genetic counselor, or a therapist you trust to talk it through. You are not alone in this. And remember, sometimes the truth does not arrive with a crash. Sometimes it is just a quiet line on a screen you weren't expecting to read. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.